The Russian army lost 1,430 soldiers and 176 units of military equipment on the front line of the war with Ukraine between May 5 and 6, according to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Russia has lost 959,500 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces reported. A total of 200 combat clashes have been recorded along the front line over the past day. Russian assault operations were concentrated on the Pokrovsk front, where 78 attacks were repelled. Ukrainian forces also repelled 18 assaults in the operational zone in Russia's Kursk Oblast. On the Kharkiv front, 4 combat clashes took place near the village of Vovchansk. On the Kupiansk front, Ukrainian forces repelled 5 attacks near the village of Zahryzove, as well as towards Novoosynove and Hlushkivka. On the Lyman front, Russian forces launched 31 attacks, attempting to advance near the settlements of Hrekivka, Novomykhailivka, Nove, Kolodiazi, Myrne and Torske and towards Zelena Dolyna. On the Kramatorsk front, Ukrainian defenders repelled 4 attacks in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar and Kurdiumivka and towards Bila Hora. On the Toretsk front, 6 Russian attacks were recorded in the areas of Toretsk and Ozarianivka. On the Pokrovsk front, Ukrainian defenders repelled 78 assaults near the settlements of Sukha Balka, Stara Mykolaivka, Vodiane Druhe, Novotoretske, Shevchenko, Udachne, Uspenivka, Troitske, Kotliarivka, Bohdanivka and Andriivka. On the Novopavlivka front, the defense forces repelled 24 Russian assaults near the settlements of Novopil, Novosilka, Pryvilne and Komar and towards Udachne. Russian troops also attacked Ukrainian positions 7 times near the village of Vysok on the Hlushkivka front. On the Siversk and Pridniprovsk fronts, the Russians did not conduct any offensive operations. In the operational zone in Russia's Kursk Oblast, Ukrainian troops repelled 18 Russian attacks. The Russians carried out 330 artillery attacks, including 8 using multiple launch rocket systems, and launched 12 airstrikes, dropping 27 guided aerial bombs. On the Vodiane and Politia fronts, no signs of Russian offensive group formations have been detected. Ukrainian troops continue to inflict significant losses on Russian personnel and equipment and are actively disrupting the Russians' offensive potential in the rear.
Since the start of the war, Ukraine has destroyed up to 8,000 Russian tanks. One Russian model that has had serious problems is the T-80 main battle tank. The Ukrainians are estimated to have destroyed around 1,000 T-80s, often using FPV drones that dive-bomb the T-80's vulnerable turret, writes former U.S. Army officer and military analyst Brent Eastwood in an article for 1945. The T-80 in Ukraine was supposed to conduct exactly these kinds of lightning attacks, but the Russians were in for a surprise. Javelin anti-tank missiles and unmanned loitering munitions did their job. In addition, the Russians remained vulnerable on the roads, long columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers slowly taking up positions. The Ukrainians simply destroyed tanks like the T-80 at the front of columns and in the rear. This slowed the initial Russian advance and created bottlenecks. An armored assault was supposed to take Kiev early in the war, but it failed to achieve a decisive victory, and the T-80 has struggled ever since. Anti-tank missiles have also scored many hits, and the Ukrainians have effectively used both conventional artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. In Ukraine, the Russians discovered that the T-80 required a lot of fuel, and its range was reduced to only 300 miles. This undermined the tank's core concept of being used to spearhead a massive effort to punch holes in enemy front lines and create chaos deep in the rear echelons. The T-80 never made it that far, and the Ukrainians ate it alive. Like the T-72, the T-80 was initially loaded manually by the crew. Then the Russians installed a carousel autoloader inside, but it didn't help. the loading process is still slow and cumbersome. In addition, this part of the tank is not heavily armored, and one spark from a drone or an anti-tank missile can cause a fire as the shells explode. This causes the T-80's turret to jump into the air and the rest of the tank to burn. This turret toss has plagued the T-80 since the beginning of the war. Russian crews have nicknamed the tank the Steel Coffin. The invaders have deployed more than 90% of their T-80s to the battlefield. Damaged tanks are sent back to the factory, repaired and upgraded to the new T-80 BVM standard, which can fire depleted uranium shells. Workers work around the clock in 3 shifts every day to build more T-80 BVMs. The BVMs are expected to have better protection against swarms of loitering drones and anti-tank missiles. But the upgrade process is slow and new tanks barely make it to the battlefield. The Russians need to decide on tactics for using armor on the front lines. The initial lightning strike that was supposed to devastate Ukraine and allow Russian marauding forces to persuade Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to surrender has failed to materialize. An attempt to penetrate the enemy's trench system has failed. Drones and anti-tank missiles have taken their toll. The only thing Russia can do is to keep more T-80s in reserve and let the best T-90Ms lunge at the Ukrainians. But the T-90Ms are struggling, as are the aging T-72s. If Russia agrees to a peace deal, they will have plenty of time to evaluate the effectiveness of these tanks. They may also realize that the Soviet-era standard operating procedures have failed. They may want to reconsider attacking Ukraine again.
Russia is experiencing a shortage of military equipment in its war in Ukraine. A video posted in a Ukrainian Telegram channel shows a convoy of old armored vehicles being sent to the front line. It's unknown where exactly the military convoy is being sent and where the video footage was shot. According to the channel, the convoy contained up to 70 T-62MV and T-62M tanks, produced from 1961 to 1975. In the frontline workshops they will be made into tank sheds, with the expectation of one-time use, according to the report. Stressing that the use of old armored vehicles reflects Russia's neglectful attitude towards its army, the channel gave 2 reasons for sending these obsolete military equipment to the frontline. Firstly, the crew members of these vehicles will most likely be used as suicide bombers. Secondly, Russia wants Ukraine to spend ammunition on scrap metal, the T-62M tanks.